The wind had a strange howl that afternoon, the kind that carried warnings from far-off hills. Clara May stood in the kitchen of the Cole Ranch house, rinsing the last plate from the midday meal. Outside, the Wyoming plains stretched endlessly, flat in some places, rolling in others, dotted with the fading gold of autumn grass. She'd come here 3 months ago, answering a job posting for a housemaid. The work was hard, the pay modest, but it was honest living. Besides, Clara had always preferred the quiet rhythm of rural life to the noise of the cities she'd left behind. She had not expected her employer, Ethan Cole, to be the kind of man she could speak to without shrinking under his gaze. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a jaw roughened by stubble and hands calloused from years of ranch work, Ethan was the sort of man who carried the weather in his posture. He wasn't unkind, but his words were scarce, always precise. Clara often caught herself wondering what kind of life a man like him had led, or what stories hid in those quiet, watchful eyes. She never asked. People like Ethan spoke when they wanted to, and not before. The storm had been building all morning, though at first, it was only a smear of gray on the far horizon. By noon, the wind had picked up, rattling the loose shutters of the ranch house. Clara noticed Ethan's unease when he glanced out the window during their midday meal. A man who had lived his life on the land could read the sky better than any weather report. "Cattle need bringing in," he had said shortly after swallowing his last bite of bread. Then he was gone, his boots heavy against the wooden porch as he saddled his horse. By the time Clara finished her chores, the wind had become fierce enough to whistle through the gaps in the old window frames. She stood in the sitting room, wringing out her cleaning rag, when she noticed movement in the pasture. Through the sheets of rain that had begun to fall, she saw Ethan riding hard, driving a small group of cattle toward the barn. The animals' dark shapes moved like shadows across the land. Then came the crack, a loud, violent, and far too close, a lightning strike tearing into a cottonwood tree at the pasture's edge. Her breath caught as she saw the great limb shear away and drop. Ethan's horse reared, startled by the explosion of sound. She watched, frozen, as his body tilted dangerously, then fell, hitting the wet earth with a force she could almost feel from the house. For a moment, she hoped he might stand. But he didn't. He lay still, rain pounding down, the horse bolting toward the far fence line. Clara's first instinct was to grab her coat. She had no plan beyond that, just the blinding knowledge that if she didn't move now, she might lose him. She pulled the heavy wool around her shoulders, tying it tight under her chin, and stepped outside into the fury. The wind shoved against her, cold rain needling her cheeks. Mud sucked at her boots as she pushed forward, her skirt dragging at her legs. The distance to him was less than a quarter mile, but with every step it felt longer, the storm making the land a hostile thing. Her breathing was ragged when she finally reached the fence line. Ethan lay face down in the wet grass, his hat gone, his hair plastered to his forehead. Blood ran from a gash just above his temple, mixing with the rainwater in small rivulets down his face. She dropped to her knees beside him, calling his name. There was a flicker of faint groan, but his eyes remained shut. She touched his shoulder, finding it solid and unyielding under the soaked fabric of his shirt. Lightning cracked again, and instinct screamed at her to move. The open pasture was no place to linger. But how could she move him? Clara wasn't small, and she'd carried heavy loads in her life, but Ethan was all muscle and bony, a man built by labor. She slipped her arms beneath his, grunting with the effort, and began to drag him backward toward the fence. The wet ground made it easier in some ways, the mud allowing him to slide, but every pull sent fire through her muscles. Her breath came in harsh bursts, mixing with the roar of the wind. By the time she reached the gate, her arms ached so badly she could hardly lift them. She paused only long enough to reposition her grip, then kept moving. The ranch house was still far, but it felt closer now, a faint shape through the rain's curtain. She thought about stopping just for a moment to catch her breath, but every second she wasted was another second the cold might steal from him. So she kept going, feet dragging through the muck, shoulders burning with the weight of his body. Somewhere along the way, she began to talk to him. Her voice was hoarse, and the words tumbled out without thought. "You're not dying on me, Ethan Cole. Not today. I don't care how stubborn you are, you hear me? You've got cattle to feed, fences to mend, a broken bar, you've got a house that needs fixing, and I can't do it alone. So don't you dare quit now." Whether she spoke for him or for herself, she couldn't tell. Maybe both. The sound of her own voice kept her from thinking about how far she still had to go. When they finally reached the porch, Clara's legs were trembling so badly she could barely climb the steps. She dragged him inside, collapsing onto the wooden floor with him beside her. For a moment, she just sat there, both of them breathing raggedly, and the air inside warmer but still heavy with the damp smell of storm. Then instinct took over again. She pulled him toward the sitting room, closer to the fireplace. Her fingers fumbled with the matches, but she managed to light the log she'd stacked earlier, the flame catching and growing until the room glowed with its flickering warmth. She worked quickly, stripping off his soaked coat and boots, her own clothes clinging cold and wet to her body. She found a dry blanket in the cupboard and wrapped it around him, tucking it tight. His skin was pale beneath the stubble of his jaw, lips tinged blue. She pressed her hand to his cheek. It was cold, too cold, and fear surged in her chest. "Stay with me," she whispered, the words a plea as much as a command. She fetched a basin of warm water from the stove and cleaned the wound on his forehead, her hands steady despite the rush of adrenaline. It wasn't deep enough to be fatal, but the bleeding had been bad. She bound it with a strip torn from an old sheet, then set about rubbing his hands and arms, trying to coax warmth back into him. Outside, the storm raged on, rattling the windows as if it meant to break in, but inside, Clara fought her own battle, a one where silence could mean defeat. Ethan groaned again, his head shifting slightly on the folded blanket she'd slid beneath it. His eyes didn't open, but his lips moved faintly, forming words she couldn't quite hear. She leaned closer, brushing damp hair from his forehead, listening. The sound was broken, barely more than breath, but it was a reminder that he was still with her, still fighting. Her heart tightened, a mixture of relief and fear tangling inside her. She realized then that she wasn't just fighting to keep her employer alive. She was fighting for a man who had come to mean something she hadn't yet dared to name. The hours crawled. She stayed by his side, feeding the fire, rewarming cloths in the basin, speaking to him whenever the silence became too heavy. At one point, she took his hand, surprised by how large and rough it felt in her own. She told him about the little things of the soup she'd planned for supper, the way the barn door had been squeaking for days, the foolish rooster that kept straying into the kitchen yard. She told him these things not because they mattered, but because they made the world feel normal. And normal was what he needed now. When at last the wind began to shift and the rain softened to a steady patter, Clara allowed herself to hope. The worst of the storm had passed, but the memory of the pastoria of lightning and blood and the dead weight of his body would stay with her. She sat back in the chair beside the hearth, watching the firelight play across his features. He looked younger in sleep, though still lined with the shadows of a life lived hard. She wondered if he'd remember any of this come morning. She wondered if he'd know how close he'd come to never seeing another sunrise. What she didn't know or couldn't have guessed was that this night, born in fear and fury, would change both their lives. But for now, there was only the crackle of the fire, the soft rise and fall of his breathing, and the steady beat of her own heart keeping time with his. Ethan awoke to the faint sound of crackling wood and the warmth of something soft and heavy covering him. For a moment, his mind floated in a fog, unable to piece together how he had come to be here. The last thing he remembered clearly was the storm, his horse rearing, the flash of lightning, the ground rushing up to meet him. Now there was only the dim glow of firelight, the muted patter of rain outside, and a figure sitting nearby, her head bowed as if in thought. It took him several blinks before he recognized Clara. She must have felt his gaze because she lifted her head, eyes shadowed with fatigue. Relief washed over her features so quickly it almost startled him. "You're awake," she said softly, as though afraid to break the fragile stillness between them. He swallowed, his throat raw, and tried to speak, but the effort pulled at the edges of the headache blooming behind his eyes. She was at his side in an instant, offering a cup of water, steadying his hand when it trembled. The warmth of her touch grounded him more than the drink itself. "A broken bar saved me," he managed, the words rasping. Her cheeks colored faintly, though she shook her head. "You would have done the same," she replied. But he knew better. The pasture was nearly a quarter-mile from the house. The mud alone would have made it near impossible to drag his weight. The thought of her out there in the storm, fighting against the wind and rain, made his chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with his injury. He wanted to ask why she'd risked so much for him, but the words lodged in his throat. She busied herself with adjusting the blanket and adding another log to the fire, as though his question would be answered in silence. When she turned back, there was something in her eyes he hadn't noticed before: a steadiness, a quiet strength. He'd always known Clara as reserved, her voice soft, her presence almost shy, but now he saw the grit beneath it, the steel that came out when the moment demanded it. It unsettled him, though not in a way he disliked. Rather, it made him see her in an entirely new light. The storm outside had lessened, but the night was still heavy with damp cold. Clara insisted he stay near the hearth, fetching a fresh pot of broth from the stove. The smell was rich and comforting, and though he could only take a few sips, the warmth spread through him, loosening the tightness in his muscles. "You need rest," she said when he tried to sit up. "Doctor can come in the morning. For now, you're not moving from that spot." He might have bristled at the command if it had come from anyone else, but her voice left no room for argument. As the hours passed, the fire's glow deepened, shadows dancing along the walls. They spoke little. She sat across from him, mending a tear in one of his shirts, the needle flashing in the firelight. Every so often, he caught her glancing toward him, as if reassuring herself he was still breathing. When he finally broke the silence, it was not to thank her though he meant to, but to ask, "Why'd you come here, Clara?" Her hands paused mid-stitch. "You mean the ranch?" He nodded. She looked down, considering her answer. "Sometimes, you go where the noise can't follow you," she said quietly. He didn't press her, though the answer stayed with him. There was a story there, one she wasn't ready to share. But he understood enough. He too had sought solitude once, after the kind of loss that hollows a man out. The land had been both a burden and a balm, something to work against when he couldn't work through the grief. Perhaps that was why her presence had never felt like an intrusion. She carried the same quiet weight he did, though she bore it differently. Sometime near midnight, the rain stopped. The air shifted, bringing with it the faint smell of wet earth and sage. Clara rose to check the windows, making sure they were latched against the chill. He watched her move, noting the way she paused by the window to look out over the darkened pasture. She stood there longer than necessary, as if gathering herself, before returning to her seat. He wanted to say something, anything that might bridge the distance between them, but the words felt too big for the space they occupied. It wasn't until a sudden shiver passed through him that she came close again, kneeling beside the chair. "You're still cold," she murmured, pressing her palm against his hand. Without thinking, he closed his fingers around hers. She tried to pull back, startled, but he held on, not with force but with the quiet insistence of a man who has found something he doesn't want to lose. Her gaze met his then, and for the first time that night, he let the gratitude he felt show plainly on his face. "You've got more courage than anyone I've ever known," he said, his voice rough. "Clara broken bar marry me." The words came as naturally as breathing, though they surprised even him. She froze, her lips parting slightly, as if unsure she'd heard correctly. "On a broken bar," she began, her voice trembling. He gave a faint smile. "I'm not saying it because you saved me. I'm saying it because I've been watching you for months, and I know what kind of woman you are. I know I'd be a fool to let you walk away." Her eyes glistened, and for a moment she looked away, as though searching for the right thing to say. "I'm not a broken bar," she started, then stopped, shaking her head. "I'm not what most men want." He leaned forward slightly, ignoring the pull of pain in his leg. "Then most men are blind." The room was quiet except for the fire. Slowly, as if testing the reality of it, she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Ethan, I will." The words seemed to settle something deep in both of them, a promise neither had been expecting when the day began. They stayed like that for a while, hands clasped, neither speaking. Outside, the clouds began to break, and a faint wash of moonlight spilled across the land. The storm had taken much of fences would be down, the cattle scattered, but it had also given them something neither could have found in any other way. Eventually, Clara eased him back against the chair and brought another blanket, fussing over him in a way that made him smile despite the ache in his body. She caught the look and rolled her eyes lightly. "You are going to be impossible after this, aren't you?" she said. "Maybe," he admitted, the corner of his mouth lifting. "But I'll make it worth your while." The warmth between them was not the sudden flare of the fire but the steady heat of something built slowly, deliberately. As the night wore on, they spoke more freely about the ranch, about the repairs needed, about small dreams neither had voiced before. There was no grand declaration beyond what had already been said, but every word carried the weight of their shared understanding. By the time the first light of dawn touched the horizon, the bond between them felt as sure as the land itself. Morning brought with it the work of mending what the storm had broken. Ethan, though still sore and unsteady, insisted on walking the property with Clara's help. They found branches scattered like bones across the yard, the barn door hanging loose on its hinges. The cattle had mostly stayed near the shelter, though a few would need rounding up later. Everywhere they looked, there were signs of the storm's fury, yet the air was fresh, the sky impossibly wide and blue. Clara felt the weight of fatigue in her limbs, but it was softened by the knowledge of what they had weathered together. By midday, the doctor arrived, a wiry man with sharp eyes who scolded Ethan for moving around too soon. Clara stood nearby, arms crossed, as if ready to enforce the orders herself. When the doctor left, Ethan gave her a mock look of surrender. "Guess I'm under house arrest," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "Consider it practice for married life." He chuckled, and the sound felt like sunlight breaking through. In truth, the thought of marriage no longer seemed strange or rushed. It felt like the next step in a story that had been quietly unfolding since the day she arrived. In the days that followed, word of the storm spread to the neighboring ranches. Neighbors stopped by with offers of help, bringing fresh bread and pies, always with a curious glance between Clara and Ethan. They did not speak openly of their engagement, not yet, but the knowledge sat between them like a steady flame. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, the same way they had that night, and talk about the future, about calves to be born in spring, about repainting the porch, about the kind of life they wanted to build. It was simple, but it was theirs. Looking back, Clara would think of that storm not as the day disaster struck, but as the night something lasting began. She had stepped out into the wind and rain believing she was fighting only to save a man's life. To be continued.